Most people who follow me on here have a pretty good grip of what's gone on this last few years and how a lot of it was unnecessary. What I'm pleased to say is in the Telegraph this weekend, there's an excellent article by Isabel Oakeshott, just to fill you in. Isabel Oakeshott wrote the lockdown diaries for Matt Hancock and basically had a very loose non-disclosure agreement. But then she released a lot of the content of a WhatsApp group messages between Hancock and other ministers and medics during lockdown. She released them as a staged release in the Telegraph. Obviously, Hancock was not very pleased and tried to stop it, but she said it was in the public interest, and she was absolutely right. A lot of you may or may not altogether see eye to eye with Isabel. She's the partner of Richard Tice in Reform. But one thing I will say for Isabel is that she is a fearless journalist and has tried to be pretty honest. There was no discussion about midazolam in those WhatsApp groups. It wasn't discussed like people think. But this is what she's telling us now about how Chris Whitty, you remember Chris Whitty, he had to buy a suit. He had to buy a suit to start going on the podium. He didn't want to be a front man. He's medical. He's into research. He's into stuff like that. He's an individual, bit of a loner. He doesn't want to be centre stage. But this just gives an insight into just how low politicians will sink. Because my gripe's always with the politicians. I watched those bulletins during lockdown, and I saw a man in Chris Whitty, strange looking man to me, but every time I saw him, I thought, he looks uncomfortable. He looks uncomfortable. That's all I could say. And he never once condoned mask wearing. He said it made very little difference. He'd know, because surgeons only wear them to stop splatter. Let's face it, when surgeons have a virus, they don't come into work. They don't operate on you when they have something transmittable. Now, Whitty's lockdown admission shows the public sector rewards failure because he's been knighted. So, against Chris Whitty, if that was me, if I felt as strongly as he obviously did, I wouldn't have accepted my knighthood. But, maybe being knighted helps him with funding for other stuff he's doing. It's not really about Chris Whitty, this, even though it's talking about him. This is about how governments decide on unsuitable legislation without thinking it through, without using this. Let's just get it done. Matt Hancock was up and down like a little schoolboy in a snake belt, like he should have had conkers in his pocket, like his mother should have had him in short pants a year longer to make him understand what growing up's about. He was just, you see, the trouble is what I saw during lockdown, too many people with the power base enjoyed it. Boris, I'm off Boris, as you probably know, but at least Boris looked uncomfortable. Hancock didn't. Hancock loved it. Hancock loved being centre stage. Ordering a takeaway meal over a fortnight period for the staff that were burning the midnight oil in Whitehall, £52,000 for takeaways. Could have bought a house in Burnley for that. So this is really, whilst it's about Chris Whitty, it's showing you the underbelly, what politicians will do. So I'm going to read part of it out. So, Whitty's lockdown admission shows the public sector rewards failure, however cataclysmic. The Chief Medical Officer has conceded we overdid it. So, why haven't many of the architects of this disaster been held to account? That's how she begins. Here's the article. The prof is pivotal, Matt Hancock observed, as he mused over how to frighten the nation into following COVID rules, writing about the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Chris Whitty, in his pandemic diaries. The former Health Secretary noted that the public seemed to like his calm, reassuring manner, which at first everybody did, because that's just how he came across. The government needed to make the most of that respect. He concluded and asked Whitty to use his most authoritative voice to make a bossy social media clip about new social distancing rules. In other words, what that bit's saying is, Matt Hancock decided to milk it for all it's worth. He decided to milk the fact he could see the public would trust Chris Whitty before they trust him. That's what that is in layman's terms, isn't it? The date was March the 25th, 2020, 2 days after Boris Johnson gave his historic address to the nation, instructing everyone to stay at home. Prince Charles had COVID, although he didn't know it yet. So did Hancock. Terrified by doomsday predictions of bodies piling high in the street and apocalyptic scenes from hospitals in Italy, the British did what they were told. No government in history had ever attempted anything remotely like it, and trust was critical. Now I'm going to interject here with something that isn't written in the piece, and that is those pictures you were shown of Italy and the hospitals. The bit that they missed out, because they were using the fear, is that the Italian hospitals were always overwhelmed every winter because they had an ageing population, a large contingent of smokers, and elderly people who lived at home with their families who couldn't cope. They weren't in nursing homes. They don't have as many nursing homes as we have. That was a critical thing that was ignored on purpose because it wouldn't have instilled as much fear. Anyway, the piece goes on. As Hancock told the House of Commons at the time, the draconian measures the government was taking to stop the spread would change the lives of everyone. The scale of public sacrifice required meant there was no room for doubt about what was at stake. Who better to convey the severity of the situation than a mild-mannered, distinguished medic like Chris Whitty? So here we go again. This is Hancock, knowing full well he isn't popular enough to get you to listen to him, because we saw him for what he was. This is a jumped-up career politician who 1 minute is the digital minister, slavering all over Klaus Schwab, because he was there going to the WEF meetings then. And then all of a sudden he's the medical officer. He's the medical minister, the health minister. These aren't in these jobs because they know a lot about health. They're in these jobs because they move them about like chess pieces. And unfortunately, I think they couldn't have had anybody worse than him. And what I always find amazing about politicians, you've got Liam Fox sat there, a Conservative politician, a seasoned politician, a Brexiteer, a doctor who made a video, sat in the House of Commons, when he said to the House of Commons, he was talking to a friend of his in Switzerland who said, it seems very polarised in Great Britain, the way that you talk about lockdowns and the unfolding pandemic. It's this or it's that. They didn't have that same anti-vaccination thing going on in Switzerland. It was more professionally handled. I'm not saying the outcome was any different, but wouldn't he have been a better health minister? Someone that understood medical knowledge, that would know what ADE was, and if you don't, look it up. Anyway, the article goes on. Very early in the crisis, Hancock clocked that he affectionately called the Prof, that's Whitty, was a very powerful asset. For all his legendary arrogance, this is Hancock, for all his legendary arrogance, the then Health Secretary was sufficiently self-aware to recognise that doctors always get better hearing than politicians. So again, the sneaky little toe rag realised that if you want to get the nation to do something, wheel out someone that looks trustable because we don't trust politicians. It's shocking when you think. In the league table of the most and least trusted professions, medics consistently rank in the top 5, alongside nurses, pilots, librarians and engineers, while politicians always, quite rightly, languish at the bottom. With his gentle demeanour and unimpeachable professional credentials, the Chief Medical Officer was the perfect person to deliver a difficult message. Hancock had lucked out, in other words, he crashed and burned, and he exploited it. Privately, the modest Whitty was far from comfortable. His new, very public-facing role was not what he wanted. Recalling how he ordered the CMO to make social media clips, repeating key mantras like the hated 2-metre rule, Hancock writes in his diaries that the professor found recording these sorts of things terribly embarrassing. Now, why would he feel terribly embarrassed? Because it just didn't sit right with him. A lot of people see Chris Whitty as some sort of evil monster. I saw him as a very uncomfortable man, compromised with political gain. The politicians were driving this, not the medics. That other bloody idiot, what's he called, Van Tam. I mean, he just all of a sudden started buying Al Capone suits and getting his hair cut like a rocker. Come on. I don't care what you look like. He enjoyed it. I think you could see he enjoyed this new vigour of being in front of the public eye. You were lapping it up. Chris Whitty just looked embarrassed. Chris Whitty looked like, oh, I don't want to be here. My husband would be like that. Nonetheless, Whitty did it, which means he cannot escape accountability for the terrible mistakes that were made. As the old Whitehall saying goes, advisers advise and ministers decide. But in these unique circumstances, it's no exaggeration to say that the Chief Medical Officer drove the pandemic response. He had not personally recommended and promoted the lockdown policies we now know were so flawed. They would simply never have happened. Accordingly, he must take full responsibility for the dreadful consequences. So I think this is a very balanced article that Isabel Oakeshott's writing here. And the reason I'm reading it out is because obviously there's a paywall on the Telegraph, and I think it's important information that's in here, because you won't get to see it on the mainstream media, will you? That's still taking the coin from the government with all the various public information films. Far too late in the public inquiry that took years to get underway and still has no end date, Whitty this week acknowledged what so many of us could quite clearly see at the time, that the government went way too far and over the top in its initial pandemic response. Of course, he didn't put it quite like that. What he actually said was giving evidence this week is, in retrospect, he's still worried about whether the government got the level of concern right. Well, that's just kind of political fence sitting, isn't it? They were over the top. The elderly should never have been left in those homes. Treatment in the hospital should never have been cancelled. Diagnosis cancelled for cancer. Cataract operations cancelled. Normally, Newcastle Hospital would do 9,000 cataract operations, or eye operations in general, in a year. They only did 2,000 that year. So where are the other people with these cataracts and these eye conditions? Are they now blind? Because many people did go blind. In a further this is back to the article, in a further remarkable concession, he went on to declare that in hindsight, ordering 2.3 million people to cut themselves off from the world entirely for 12 weeks may have done more damage than it prevented. He now says he is unsure he would go down that route again because it caused significant harms. Well, my question is, you shouldn't have gone down it. You should have stood up to Hancock. You should have used your medical prowess to backchat these MPs who can come and go like a puff of smoke. Where's Hancock now? You've got a man who had control of the entire nation and their freedoms. And what did we last see him? Sliding down a load of mud in the jungle, earning himself 500 grand. These people are despicable. They're not interested in you and me. You've got to forget that. They're not. They're interested in themselves, and if they can't make it as a politician, they'll go on Strictly Come Dancing, and if they don't get invited on that, they'll go in the jungle. These are just people who want to be in the public eye. They've no shame. Can you imagine telling people to cancel their weddings and creating a tier system so that people's weddings were cancelled multiple times? Funerals were attended by 6 people when people had a shed load of friends and family. You couldn't hug your mother when her husband's died in the funeral home. He instigated all that, and yet there he is groping Gina's backside, and she lived in another house and he's going home to a wife and 2 kids. These are despicable people. Back to the article. Say what? This is extraordinary. If Whitty is no longer sure that the elderly and most vulnerable around whom the entire response to the pandemic allegedly revolved needed to self-isolate, why on earth is it left off the case of anyone else locking down? In this characteristically understated way, Whitty appears to have shattered the case for lockdowns. I'll read that again. In this characteristically understated way, Whitty appears to have shattered the case for lockdowns. If even he wouldn't repeat the policy, who would? So the thing that stands us instead there is when the WHO comes up with any bollocks for the future, we have got it here in black and white in the Telegraph from the COVID inquiry via Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, that it's not something he would do again. So we're going to hold that to account if anybody tries this stuff again on an international basis. Sadly, it's taken so long to extract this confession. that the significance is in danger of being lost. Well, not by me, it isn't. That weren't in. For just that criminally wasteful public inquiry is finally starting to get interesting. Most ordinary people have lost the will to live and are no longer affording it any attention. Who can blame them? Well, this is where we have to afford it attention. This is where we have to keep discussing it, because these comedians will try again. And it might come from a higher body. It might come from the World Economic Forum. It might come from the WHO. It might come from these NGOs, these non-government organisations who seem to have tremendous power these days over and above our own government. So we have to be ready for that. We have to be ready. And the more you talk about this, you just mention the article. Have you seen the article about Chris Whitty in the Telegraph? Oh, it's a belter. He's obviously admitted grievous mistakes that the government made. Just say that. You don't need to read the article out like I am. I'm doing it because we can on this YouTube channel. What I'm saying is open it up to people you talk to in the supermarket, on your dog walk, when you're going to a friend's. Open it up, remind them that it's coming out in the COVID inquiry. This hasn't gone away, because you need to forewarn them, because when they try it again, more people will turn around and say, I'm not having any of it. I'm not. We have had months and months of irrelevant minutiae from the civil service and other dreary figures nobody has ever heard of, that a government which spends so much time wailing about the state of the public finances nonetheless sees fit to spend £137,000 every single working day simply responding to this charade beggars belief. That's how much it's costing the inquiry. Can you believe it? Shamefully, that official figure, 9.285 billion in the first quarter of this year on civil servants and lawyers alone, is literally only half of it. Every day the COVID inquiry itself spends almost the same amount again. So the lawyers don't work for the government, the lawyers are paid by the government, so they're having some right coin coming in their tills, aren't they? Their balance sheet at the end of this year, that'll be healthy, won't it? Just, government, open the tax coffers and help yourself. The whole ruinously expensive exercise may not be of Labour's making, but as they wail about the great black holes in the public finances, they most certainly have the power to stop it, as many of us have argued. All it is needed is to answer the single most important question: were national lockdowns ever necessary or justified, and should they ever be repeated? No. That's it in a nutshell. As weary as we may all be of the Baroness Hallett's Borathon, an answer to this question could hardly be more consequential. Therefore, what Whitty has to say deserves a very close scrutiny, especially since he considers another pandemic is inevitable. Bit by bit, the edifice he and Hancock constructed to imprison us is now falling down. From the absurdity of the medically meritless piece of cloth we were forced to wear over our faces, to the unforgivable sacrifice of a generation of children who were needlessly deprived of going to school, so much of what we were told has now been exposed as a monstrous lie. This is a creditable journalist saying this in the Telegraph. Whilst youngsters are resilient and most bounce back, a small but significant number are still suffering and will never achieve their full potential. No, they won't, because we told them they were going to kill Granny. What they did to kids. I mean, I didn't struggle with lockdown because I live in an isolated house, nice big garden, my dogs, Dave. I'm okay, I can go and fill my fridge up. Well, I didn't, Dave did. But how many people were stuck in terraced houses with backyards with 3 kids with 1 laptop trying to educate them? How can you educate 3 kids with 1 laptop? It's all right for yummy mums in the sprawling houses in London eating their tofu lunches because Poppet's on one computer and Jemima's got her own. This just sickens me beyond belief. As Whitty admits, there's a whole additional group of lockdown victims, those who were condemned to an early death, of long-term suffering because ministers put protecting the NHS ahead of caring for those who use it. That's a poignant phrase, that, isn't it? Ministers put protecting the NHS ahead of caring for those who use it. Absolutely they did. And if the NHS worked properly, we wouldn't have had to save it. It would have been saving us. That's the bit that's wrong. The CMO now concedes that in their desperation to prevent the health service from becoming overwhelmed, those in charge of the pandemic response failed to convey that it was still open for business. How utterly ridiculous. Unforgivable. The trouble is, it wasn't the gatekeepers to the system. GPs literally shut up shop, posting hostile messages on surgery doors. No wonder people failed to get lumps and bumps checked out. What really rankles is that the architects of this historic disaster are still sitting pretty. So far from the downfall they deserve. They have prospered, knighted for his public service. Whitty is still in an almighty position of power as Chief Medical Officer. Meanwhile, his pandemic sidekick, former Chief Scientific Officer Patrick Vallance, is literally lauding it, having recently been given a peerage to join Keir Starmer's front bench. Sickening bunch. As for Hancock, mercifully, since stepping down as an MP, has temporarily disappeared. Rumour has it that he has landed a plum job in the Middle East. Oh God, I hope he sweats his rocks off. If so, those still suffering as a result of his blunders won't be shedding any tears. I think that's amazing, that article. Two things that have happened this weekend. Rosie Duffield's resignation, sticking it right up Keir Starmer. There you go, have it. That's what that is. That's a have it. That's what her resignation letter is, isn't it? Go on, have it. I think it's a belter. It's in my other video, so have a look because I've got a video out on it. I've read it out. And this article by Isabel Oakeshott concentrating on the most pivotal point of the COVID inquiry, which is, why did you do it, Chief Medical Officer? And unfortunately, well, you know, I had to. Politicians put me up to it. Yeah, fair enough, but you still caused havoc. It was havoc. Put yourself in an old people's home. I feel really strongly about this. You've brought your family up. You've sent them to school. You've washed the football strip. You've made the sandwiches. You've packed your husband lunch. You've put your washer on. You've done all the things in life you're supposed to do. Paid your mortgage off. Hopefully going to leave your kids a bit of something. And you end up in care. So what is that exactly? That is, you've no possessions left. The home you built up with love and toil is now dismantled and ends up in a house clearance. And you've no possessions. You've what's going to fit in a bedside cabinet and a double wardrobe in a small room, hopefully with a window looking out on a view, or if you're unlucky enough, a bloody car park. And there you sit, and the only highlight in your week is your loved ones coming in, multiple loved ones, you know, your children or a grandchild, bringing you a bit of something that you like, something that's your favourite, some grapes or anything, a bit of cake you've made at home, making sure they've been fed because they've got dementia and they don't eat, and when there's a shift change they don't get the food. So you've got that continuity where someone's just looking out for you. That's all you've got left. That's all you have left. And they took it away from them. They just took it away from them. While they were groping the girlfriend, while Ferguson was nobbling his girlfriend, even though he tested positive, Cummins was off up to wherever he went, County Durham, for whatever fantastical reason that was. These people got on with that. They were partying. Partying while you're locked down, partying while your wedding's cancelled, partying while your funeral has 5 people, not 50. Partying while your mother shakes with grief and you can't put her arm round her. That's what these people did. And that's why you shouldn't forget.